Welcome, everyone, to today's webcast, How to Conquer Cloud Complexity. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian. I am the Chief Innovation Officer at Cyber Risk Alliance. Of course, the founder over here at Security Weekly, is still doing all of the lovely shows and webcasts and having a lot of fun doing it. I tend to bring on my friends to the show. And Adrian, we decided to also hire him as a full-time employee as well. So you'll see Adrian on these webcasts now. Adrian Sanabria is the Senior Research Engineer at Cyber Risk Alliance. Adrian, welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, glad to be here.
And, of course, Dr. Mike Lloyd, the CTO over at RedSeal. Mike, welcome.
Always a pleasure to be here.
It's going to be a fun conversation. I mean, we have slides and stuff, but mostly we have the three of us that are just going to talk. And when we've done the prep for this, I think we did 2 prep calls. And Adrian, I think you said yesterday, like after each of them, we were like, we should have recorded that. Now we get to record it. Now we're recording it. So
this is the real one.
That's it. So Adrian and Mike, I'll turn it over to you to go through the agenda.
All right. Yeah. So I put this together. Had a little fun with the Willy Wonka, boat tunnel scene here, but just kind of almost less of an agenda and more of kind of the journey through InfoSec, which is part of what Mike's going to go through here. Where in the early days things were fairly simple, and then things got very, very complicated on the IT side, and unfortunately, security has at least felt like we've been a step or two behind technology, most of the way, where technology moves very, very quickly. We jumped into Web 2.0, into cloud, people bringing in their own devices, and we've always struggled to catch up with this stuff and secure it. And there was kind of a dark time there, I guess, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, where you saw a lot of the industry catching up, where almost everything we had was preventative, and we had very little visibility and very little ability to detect and respond to attacks. We saw the term of dwell time emerge. We had to create a metric just to keep track of how many months it took us to recognize an attack. Like, how bad is that?
But we realized it was measured in months, not seconds.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And the average is still up in months. We're not sub-month yet as far as the average goes, for at least in the breach reporting. So, it's refreshing nowadays. I hear CISOs, saying that they're aiming to get down to minutes, minutes and hours on their detection and response times. So it's very good to hear that, and I hope the rest of the industry follows suit with that.
I think you nailed it with the Willy Wonka GIF, right? That's great. I'm thinking, could we record an entire session on, every security lesson is somewhere in Willy Wonka, if you think about it, right? The executives who want it now, right? Organizations that turn into blueberries, Mike TV, right? The idea of just rapid consumption of whatever is the latest and greatest thing with all the security risks that go with it. I mean, you really could tell all kinds of security parables just from Willy Wonka.
I never thought
that really
about
made it for me.
Yeah, I never thought about it. But
there's no earthly way of knowing which direction we are going. That's how it's felt.
Certainly.
Wouldn't you love in security to have a magic device you could plug anything into and it would go good egg, bad egg?
Yeah.
Wow.
Exactly.
On the next webcast.
Yeah, we'll come back to that one.
Yeah. So this is just highlighting the fact that we're. In this a really useful framework here developed by Sunil Yu called the Cyber Defense Matrix, and kind of lays out like the main categories of security product, where they lie, and then the different places where we implement those controls, anywhere from people, from employees, to devices, networks, data, everything in between. And you can see there, throughout the 90s and most of the 2000s, we were entirely in this protect category. With vulnerability management, we started to get into the identify category, but that still didn't give us the level of visibility we needed to detect attacks. So in the last couple of years, we've really seen things like EDR and XDR, a lot more full packet capture, type NDR devices, and just a lot more emphasis on detect and respond. As we realized here, we saw these dwell time metrics and realized we need to get better at detecting these attacks when they happen, because we're just not having much success with stopping them.
Absolutely. No, and Sunil, your work on this is fantastic, right? This chart is great. There, all the variants of it where you can sort of map out all the technologies, and then you suddenly start seeing gaps that you couldn't see before, right? This is a great tool for mapping out security teams' work. And if you drop down all the technologies you have onto this grid and you see a large amount of white space, go think about that, right? Me, I'm a network guy, right? But I've been watching the industry evolve. Where I started in this quite a while ago, over there on the middle left for networks, where we were just trying to find it all, and then trying to migrate to the right to say, okay, we're not going to be able to stop everything, but how do you respond and recover? How do you achieve resilience? That's been a big evolution. So you can really track a lot of the motion of the security space in this one chart.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and talking about things getting complicated, the device explosion here, that's always a huge challenge. In the early days, it was you had Windows or Unix, maybe some Linux, maybe a few Macs in the marketing department, people using publishing software and things like that. But now we're putting computers into everything, and those computers can connect to Wi-Fi, they can connect to networks. And, controlling anything from lighting to message boards in a call center, there's all kinds of things we have to worry about. So this explosion happened very, very quickly. Well, Adrian, in the space of 10 years.
When you say this is complicated, I don't know that I dispute that. I'd also say it's more complicated today when we talk about the cloud. And when I see this slide, I'm reminded of the time in the early 2000s. I was working for the university. And largely to map my network, Mike, you spent a lot of time and still do to this day in network mapping and the iterations beyond that, of course. But let's go back to early 2000s. I would run Nmap, and I would map my network, and I would find pretty much everything on this slide. Like, you could find everything on this slide if you ran your Nmap scan, because largely
finding
back then,
it was one thing. Identifying what the heck it was, and who owned it,
and who owned it, that was huge.
The harder part.
At the university and other organizations, certainly, identifying it to exactly what it was and who owned it was a totally different problem. But I could still break out my Nmap port scanner and I could scan it. I even wrote my own port scanner and modifications to Nmap because the attackers would install malware that listened on a port so they could distribute things and do it for their backdoor communication channel. And you needed just like a regular banner grabber, right? Because it really didn't respond to the kind of protocol probes. It was just a straight up banner. So I actually wrote that and had great success. Even at the time in 2001, right, I was managing a pretty big network. There was tens and thousands of nodes across a 144-acre campus. I could still map most of the network with the tools and find all of this stuff. Where I think
you can find stuff, but Nmap there is like taking a flashlight and shining it under your fridge.
Exactly.
Right. You're going to find some nasty crud down there.
Yes.
But now, next question: is this bad?
Yes.
That's an image.
We don't know it's there.
Right. Yeah, and what is it, and is it bad or good, or what's its function? And when I did this, I found the time clock system, right? And just that discovery then kind of gets you to the next level. I think it was Kronos, actually, right? And it's like, well, how do I protect that? Who should have access to that? What are the attack paths to that? So it allowed you to at least ask those questions that came after, which now I think we can answer more smartly. But however, we're much more complicated in the cloud with ephemeral networks and services and systems and hosts.
Yeah, if you want to switch to the next slide, the next slide's all about that.
And then cloud happens. Yeah,
this is the double click, right? On that entire previous slide, there were like 2 items in there for Azure and AWS. And they just seem like 2 items. But then you double click those and they expand and whoa, hang on, there's a whole other world in there.
And there's a few animations here, Paul, because this is a bit of a head fake.
Wow.
That's 5 years ago.
Yep.
And I think two more clicks, and we'll finish this one out. So that's
Alex,
today.
look, all these cloud vendors are slowly reinventing 1990s networking.
Yeah.
If you look at all the innovations they come up with, like span ports, they recently reinvented span ports, right? Remember those?
Well,
Yeah.
And it's not a lot of it's choice too. It's like not everybody wants to use a relational database, so here's a dozen different choices.
Right. And so Paul, you started to touch on this earlier, right? The earlier slide, it's just a list, and it's a list of stuff that a lot of which we're familiar with, we're comfortable with. But what is complexity, right? And I think that's relevant to the thread we're on here about conquering cloud complexity. And I ended up thinking about that a lot, about what really is complex. Well, it looks like most complexity that we encounter in the world is a mountain of simple things. If you look at any one simple thing, you could ask yourself, well, that's not that complicated. Yeah, but try and do that simple thing, let's say to secure something, for everything on this list. Suddenly it becomes complicated just because there's a lot of it. That's what a haystack is, right? We all know about the needle in the haystack, right? But a haystack is complicated just because, not because straw is hard, but because a big pile of straw is difficult. Every piece is different.
Yeah, and it's also the relationships between everything that the business cares about and security cares about, but for different reasons. The business has to operate, and we know that people need to access these systems, and the data from those systems needs to go here so that we can function as a business, right? And from security, you're like, well, I need to make sure that those things happen, but also in a secure manner, and make sure that no one else who shouldn't have access to that system or that process or that data does not. It was similar to my discovery of, there's Chronos time clocks. And most people that were building those systems thought, put them on the network, and that's, people can connect to it, and that's good. As attackers, we put our attacker hat on. We're like, wait, what if people who aren't authorized are able to do stuff? What are they able to do, and what are the repercussions? And then how do we prevent that, right? I think that's when it's, as hackers, we start to think differently about these problems.
Exactly. Adrian, I know we're running everywhere with your slide here, but this slide to me is two different things depending on how you look at it, right? It's one slide, but if you look at it from a business and money-making point of view, it shows great innovation, right? There's this huge pace of innovation. Every one of these things is being built, not because some geek at Amazon thinks it will be fun to do this, but because it makes money, right? So all of this innovation is healthy from a business point of view. So if you put your business hat on, this is really good. It's showing how dynamic and innovative and rapidly changing the cloud world is because there's real demand for it. But now swap hats over to security, just like you're talking about, Paul. And all of this complex stuff interacts in really funky ways that people haven't thought through, right? This is like systemic financial collapse, right? The mortgage crisis or something like that. You get all these complex interacting parts, each one of which came along for a perfectly good reason. But with the security hat on, this is terrifying because the degree of interaction is going up by at least the square of the number of items on this page. Right? It's arguably worse than that. But each one of these things interacting with all these other things, you've got at least n squared of this much stuff suddenly showing up in IT fabric, and now your job is to secure it. That's cloud complexity.
For sure.
And a lot of this stuff can have different access control rules, permissions. You talk to I talk to some companies that have hundreds of AWS accounts. And applications spread across those different accounts. And then you can add different regions to the equation, and different regions have access to different numbers of these products. Some of these products exist in some regions, but not others. Some of them work differently in those regions because of, local data residency requirements, regulations, things like that.
And there are different collections of these various services that we lovingly refer to as VPCs in Amazon's AWS that can behave completely differently. So you may think you've got the problem solved because I know I configured this VPC, but then someone spins up another one and it doesn't have the same rules. And you're like, that could be a problem.
Doesn't even use the same,
and you can bring a checkpoint firewall into all this and just make it entirely crazy.
Yeah.
The service chaining stuff is mind expanding, but yeah, even within the native security controls that all these things come with, right? At least the world has learned enough to think you can't just ship a product anymore without thinking about security. You have to build some kind of access control feature onto it. The problem is each one of these little micro dots you got on the slide here, they each invented their own way of doing access control. There's really no standard uniform way of doing it. And some of them are amazingly complicated, right? we've had all these problems with S3 buckets, but S3 access control is a unique, subtle art unto itself, to the point where Amazon has had to make their own security analysis product just to explain back to you what your S3 rules say.
Yeah.
That's a tiny part of a VPC. And now you've got hundreds of VPCs in an organization.
That's an interesting perspective, Mike, because it should be more uniform. Because I ran into this problem when you configure a container registry. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. How I control access to my container registry is completely different from how I control access and the rules I apply to my S3 bucket. Like, they're two completely different languages, so to speak.
Right.
And it's the same thing. VPCs, and it's all different. I'm like, why? Hold on. Wouldn't it be better to have a more common language?
That would be lovely. I was having this actually debate with a good friend and an internet luminary just the other day on LinkedIn, where he was saying, it's a sign of immaturity that we don't have that standard language. Right. And I just shot back that, and how many decades did we work on standardizing the management of physical networks, and how well did that work?
Right.
We are decades away from uniform standards for managing all this.
Yeah.
So, so I agree with my buddy who was saying, look, it is a mark of immaturity, and eventually it will get fixed by having standardized, uniform ways of doing this. But that happens in the late stage, right? There's a bell curve of evolution, and as you tail down the bell curve, once the innovation slows down, the standardization begins to set in. But exactly your point, Adrian, with this slide, right? That we're nowhere near that settling down and maturity phase. We are decades away from there being good standards. But that means now, today, if you work at a company who has cloud footprint, and if you don't, good luck to you. Where do you work? Then you have to understand all of this burgeoning fabric with all of its complex chaos, and it's not going to settle down, in our working careers, in a one-job lifetime.
Yeah, I think we've.
And there's not really incentive for AWS to standardize too much, because they are the 800-pound gorilla. They can do what they want there. They're building their own switches. They've got their own silicon manufacturing. They lay their own undersea cables. The rest of the industry is doing 4 gig Ethernet, and they do or 40 gig, and they do 50 gig. Because it's at their scale. It matters more to them for it to work well in their environment than for them to standardize with anyone else. And that's just on the back end. So that's some insight into why the front end is kind of disjointed and all different.
Good old Mac OS and Windows, right? Where was the motivation to standardize between those two, right? We had two different founders.
Until Apple was on the hurting really bad, and Steve Jobs came back. And all of a sudden, we had Microsoft Office on the Mac. We had USB ports on the Mac. We got rid of all the proprietary Mac stuff. All of a sudden, they were very compatible. And then once they won that market share back, we saw them move away again. And iPhones are still Lightning. They're still not USB-C. So it's interesting to see that how market dominance affects whether or not you conform and standardize.
And it took decades. And speaking of decades, that looks like me.
Yeah, I just want to say I think we've done a really good job of, and certainly I've thought about different perspectives of why the cloud is complex, why there is so much complexity in today's systems, what complexity means. And Mike, now I'm really anxious to hear what you have to say about how do we overcome this complexity and make sense of it, right? And I'm starting to draw some parallels to, like, I thought that viruses and pandemics, we get sick and we mount a response, and that was kind of it. Now that we've got this global pandemic, like, wow, there's a lot more here than I thought. It's more complex than I thought. Very similar to my journey in the cloud. I was like, oh, well, you just take a system and you move it to the cloud. And then once I dig in, I'm like, there's a whole ton of complexity here, right? So in both cases, how do we get a handle on it? And there's some great parallels there too.
Yeah, so some folks in China get sick, and now all of a sudden we here and everybody in the UK and everybody in South Africa all suddenly have to change our behavior.
Right.
What? How did the world get that interconnected? But epidemics have a lot to teach us. So yeah, my background on this, I was once an epidemiologist. So I've been mucking around with complex interacting systems for, I counted up recently, 35 years. So in the mid 80s, I was studying epidemiology. At the time, we didn't have this great pandemic going on. Well, we had a different one. AIDS was the big news at that stage. So I was, as an academic, I was studying these complex interacting systems, but like most academics, I wasn't making any money. And so what I ended up doing about every decade was changing what the name of the field was, but basically doing the same work under different labels. So in the 80s, it was academic epidemiology, where I was understanding how diseases spread across a network of people, or a network of foxes studying rabies spread in England. But in the 90s, I called it network management. That's how I got into the middle of Sunil Yu's slide. I was looking at networks, because networks really fundamentally are like disease processes. If you understand how a router actually works, it learns about some connected subnets, and then it tells its neighbors, and they tell their neighbors, and they tell their neighbors. So routing is fundamentally a disease process. In a sense, we all infect the internet with our routing data. And so that's how I ended up as a network management guy, because it made a little more money. And I say every 10 years I change what we call it, but I've still been doing the same thing. In the it was network control, where we use the same kind of complex system thinking to control networks to make them more efficient, so they'd be faster, cheaper, able to sustain video, which, thank God, in this pandemic, we now actually have network fabric where we can all just routinely use Zoom all day, right? I think everybody presenting this is old enough to remember when networks were not good enough to do this, and we really have gotten a whole lot better. But of course, as we've gone through those decades, we haven't reduced the fragility much. So in the 2010s and now into the 2020s, I realized, well, security is now the next frontier of, we've got complex interacting systems, just like the epidemics. But now what we're trying to do is understand how bad guys propagate and how failures occur in systems, or even in systems of systems. So, I suppose it's my lack of imagination. I just keep using the same mathematical machinery for 35 years. But the problem never seems to go away. We never seem to get to a world where we just simplify down, and we don't need complex analysis anymore. So there's still a market for understanding complex interactions, and these days it's all about the cloud. It's how do we apply this now to cloud fabric so that we can not make a complete pig's breakfast of the security these cloud fabrics we're building. So that's what I do at RedSeal. So we've been talking about pandemics a fair bit, and as you said, Paul, we've had conversations at Security Weekly as well about this. But I wanted to go over just briefly the parallels. Right, there are some really big parallels between epidemics and security. Right, and it's because they're not just individual element effects, right? That's where you were going, Paul. That we think we live reasonably healthy lives, right? We try to behave reasonably well. A cigar now and again, okay, fair enough. But when you think just as individual elements, you miss how devastating a pandemic can be. To understand how a disease can spread from start in Wuhan all the way around the world and impact all of our daily lives, well, you have to be able to understand how a system behaves, how airlines fit into all of this, and how international trade fits into all of it, and how the movement of people makes long-distance interaction so routine. And so when you think about computer networks, they too get viruses, and those viruses evolve. We've watched in the security space, we watch decades of evolution of threats as the attacks get smarter and smarter. Right? It used to be, boot prompt stuff as we exchange floppy disks, and that's how viruses spread. But as we made our networks more connected, the viruses, in computer terms, evolved right along with it, all the way up to the SolarWinds kind of breach, where now it's like that's getting into the nervous system now. That's like now the thing that you use to sense the outside world is being used against you, and this is exactly how biological mechanisms evolve, right? So you can see a very strong parallel there. But one thing we can see looking at biology that I think the security industry has been slow to learn is biological mechanisms who've evolved in for millions of years to deal with these escalating threats. They aim for resilience rather than perfect protection. Right? We don't have iron plates on our skin to stop diseases getting in. We have porous skin, and that gives us an ability to breathe. It's very, it makes us lighter weight than we would be if we were made like a tank. But it means we just deal with the fact that we're susceptible to some things, and then we have biological mechanisms to help us bounce back. We have these things like immune systems. But computers and networks don't have those. And so the world we're in is we have these computer networks that we have to defend, and we have to think of them almost like patients with compromised immune systems. right? Because your network doesn't have the ways to fight back that humans have, and they're just as porous, just as fragile. They're not built with iron skin because that's too inflexible. So agile systems need a way to bounce back, and we have to figure out how to build that, right? That's the stage we're at.
That's a great parallel, because we've always said a really secure computer is buried in the ground underneath concrete, 100 feet
useless.
down, but it's useless, right? If we were to have things like iron skin, it would impede our ability to do certain behaviors as humans, right? So I think that's a really good parallel.
Well, and it's just echoing a slide earlier, right? That profusion of rapid change in all the cloud fabric. If you look at it from a business point of view, that's positive, that's growth, that's vitality. From a security point of view, it's terrifying because we're making more fragile organisms that don't have immune systems.
I think,
Adrian.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think a lot of people see InfoSec as a technical problem to be solved, security in general, when there are a lot of thinking problems too, and you're pointing out that, a lot of security folks, even today, it's less so today, still have that 100% or nothing security thinking, where they'll dismiss a solution that is solves part of the problem or gets you 80% of the way there, and by holding out for something that's 100% that's never going to come, they forego the security they could have, and
right.
I think that's why for so long we neglected the detect and respond.
Right. Well,
part of that matrix.
Going back to Sunil Yu's matrix, right? That 5x5 matrix where you have to somehow fill in all the squares. And there was a great choice you had there of material, right? Right along the bottom, I don't know if people are familiar enough to remember this, but there's this sliding scale where at one end towards the left, it's all technology. And as you go towards the right, it's all people. And that too is another great insight that Sunil captured. But it's meaningful as well, right? If we're trying to talk about how to have a network immune system for your cloud fabric, it's going to have to be this mixture of technology and people. It's not going to be a magic technological pill, to your point, right? It's not going to be, just something will come along and solve all this. We have to figure out how to have humans get better at this thing that they're really not very good at, which is understanding complex interactions. And that's why I don't try to make a piece of software that just solves the whole problem. I try to bring down the complexity for the human so that the human can still be effective, because it really is human-computer teams who have to play this role now of being the immune system. It's not going to be just plug in widget of the week and now your problems are over, right? We've tried that for decades in this business and never worked.
I think one of the skills of information security professionals and hackers alike are that the ability to interpret data in order to make decisions. And when the global pandemic broke out, there was a lot of people saying all kinds of things. When I came at that from my hacker persona, I was like, this isn't all this dissimilar of I've got systems deployed in the cloud. How would I best protect them? Well, what data do I have that I can go back on and help me make those decisions? The same thing when I asked Mike a lot of questions about, well, so wait, if someone is fully vaccinated, can they still spread the disease? And then that's a question that I would ask of, well, if I were to spin up this container inside the cloud, how could I prevent someone from, unauthorized access to that container? Very similar questions. I want to rely on some data to help make those decisions. And Mike, that is such a huge parallel. And I think probably the common foundation in a lot of our conversations that we have both on and off air about the parallels between information security and epidemiology.
No, it's absolutely right. But now, of course, I think the current state, just with a snapshot of where we are in security, we don't have a lack of data problem. We have a lack of insight problem, right? We built all these data lakes and we pump huge amounts of facts into them. But those hoping that will then be enlightened because we have this lake full of facts. But the data doesn't analyze itself, right? And so the human has to still, get the little rowboat out onto the data lake and go rowing out and go find something.
That's great.
I liken that to instead of getting the haystack off the needles, you dump the haystack on yourself. You just buried yourself.
And this isn't what I prepared the slides on, but I like this angle that I think the big problem we face in security, certainly what I try to do at RedSeal, as we build our technology, the way I think of it, but I think it's a broader theme than that. It's what we need to do generally is we have to use technology to get this problem down to human scale.
Yeah.
Right. The profusion you laid out, Adrian, has exploded beyond human scale. Humans can't do it. But machines can't either. Machines are too stupid, right? AI hasn't worked, right? Self-driving cars are still not here, right? These problems are harder than they appear to be. So it's not like we can just have a machine, right? The industry's gone down the pipe dream of, oh yeah, we'll just have a machine figure out what normal behavior is in the network and then flag every anomaly. That didn't work, right? Because healthy networks, just like we talked about, are always changing. Healthy networks do new things all the time for good reasons. Right. So you can't find the bad stuff with just a perfect robot that understands what's going on. So what can you do? You have to have a human who can understand what's going on. And right now, the network complexity outstrips what the humans can do. So that's where I come in with technology and try to say, can we use technology to boil down the ocean of complexity, get you down to a picture you can understand at human scale, and then the human can do the game theory, the politics, the
critical
poker play.
I think humans are really good at that critical thinking, whereas machines are really good at providing data and maybe doing that automated data analysis as best they can. What they can't do is that critical thinking. When people say, well, this blood type is more immune, or if you take more vitamin D, and I'm like, well, hold on, where are all the data sources to that? And let me see them and analyze them. And it's that critical thinking that will allow you to arrive at an opinion or decision based on that data. But I can't do that all on my own. Some machines have to go collect and crunch that data.
It's all
there's some great correlation versus causation examples out there, that kind of exemplify that, like, yeah, we could let machines make decisions, but here's why not.
Right.
Like the Nicolas Cage movies versus people drowning in pools or something like that is one of them.
Yeah. So, there's more we can talk about, I think, on this line about the human computer team and what can a human do to work better with machinery, and what can the machinery do to fit in better with the human. Again, like Sunil's sliding scale. I need to get there. I'm watching time. So let's proceed another slide, and then maybe I'll skip through the next couple because they just unpack this point, right? Because we've talked some about the parallels with the pandemic. Yep. Just to abbreviate this down a bit, one of the things the pandemic has taught us, right, is new language. Right. So part of what we're talking about here is how inside security can we do a better job of learning stuff from the data. But we also have been handed this great gift for communicating outside security to the stakeholders, to the people who fund what we do, to the business decision makers. This gift of new language from the pandemic, because everybody now understands these terms like social distancing, contact tracing, and the value of washing your hands, right, and wearing a mask. Right?
Yeah. Well, and just to drill on that, because we've talked a lot about masks and we've talked a lot about antivirus, and I think there's a great parallel, right? Because I think as security practitioners, we're like, well, antivirus, yeah, you could say like it doesn't work, or endpoint detection, or whatever the case may be. But when you talk to people like pen testers, they're like, it does slow me down, but only if it's configured very well and correctly. I think masks are the same boat. Some people say masks don't work, whatever the case may be. I think if you study the facts, Mike, I'll defer to you. If both people everyone's wearing a mask and wearing it properly, and it's the right mask, your defensive measures go up exponentially. It's the same thing with endpoint detection. If it's configured right, you can thwart more different types of attacks and do that better. Is that a pretty obvious parallel?
Exactly right. I mean, with the masks, we know it's still controversial because there are still, I'll say idiots out there who don't see the value. But back up half a step to hand washing, right? We all know security professionals who, looking at the hand washing advice, would say, oh, but hand washing doesn't protect you against all possible ways you could get a nasty thing into your system.
Right.
Yeah, so what? That doesn't matter. The point is hand washing is extremely effective at killing very large numbers of germs. So people, please wash your hands.
Yeah.
More than you used to, right? It really is the main countermeasure we have against this novel virus. And somebody pointed out to me the other day that this is a great point, that human intuition loves proportionality. When we like it when small things have small causes and big things have big causes, and we get very weirded out when there's a mismatch. So we know this coronavirus thing is really complicated and weird. That bug we got on the screen there, it just evolved, and there's lots we don't know about it. So it's really, really complicated. So we expect our countermeasure must be incredibly complicated to go with it. No.
Yeah.
Our main countermeasure is soap and water.
Yeah.
And it really works. It really does kill this thing, right? It really does break down the membrane and stop it getting into your eyes and your nose if you just wash your hands when you come in from outside. And so as human intuition goes, we struggle with that. We struggle with the idea that, wait, how can something that simple be effective against this dramatic, important new virus? But it does work. And we have to learn that in our daily lives about hygiene, but obviously we have to learn that in cybersecurity as well, right?
Yeah.
That people lose track of the fact that basic hygiene in networks is critical, right? This is still your point about masks as well, right? We can get all tangled up in our security debates about, well, exactly how effective is a mask, and does it need to be an N95 or not? And does 2 layers of N95 work better? That's how security people think. That's how we're all trained. Our whole culture is to go that way. But the fact is, it's really appropriate to just wear any fabric covering over your face when you're outside.
Yeah.
And it works really, really well. And we struggle to apply that in security because we love to move on to the latest shiny technology, right? We love to move on to the greatest new countermeasure because we know our adversaries are really smart, right? The PLA and the Russians, they're all out to get us, and they're really, really good. And so we tend to assume we need proportionality. We need our defenses to be as advanced as those attackers. And it just isn't true, right? And the virus teaches us this. To have a good countermeasure against something really novel and really scary like COVID-19, soap and water, people. It really works.
Yeah.
Sorry, I did get a bit carried away with that, didn't I?
No, I think one of the things that really helps is understanding, and I encourage this on the security side too, is study, these negative events, go through the details of how they actually happened. Because oftentimes in the media, you'll find out about one highlight, like one, maybe the way the attackers initially got in the network, or it focuses on the outcome, what the ransomware did, and you don't hear about, step 1 through step 12 of how it got to that point. And that information can be really useful. And like with the coronavirus as well, just understanding, it can take as long as 5 minutes, for you to get enough of the virus. So that whole concept that like, a tiny amount isn't going to be enough for you to become infected and sick with it. Like you need a certain amount, I think is really important to understand. Like, it could take 5 minutes talking face to face with someone for you to get enough of it, or a single cough or sneeze.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing. You see that
you can get it like that, or
you see that news snippet where really advanced Russian attackers did X, Y, Z, and I mean, we as security professionals, we know that it's usually not just one group. Like there is a very complex matrix of. Maybe they bought the 0-day from someone. There was someone else in the Russian group that was responsible for maintaining it and doing one stage of the attack. And yes, there may be very advanced attackers, but we know when we look at all the pieces that not everyone involved was the most advanced attackers, right?
And what do we call that thing you just described? We have a word for it. It's an ecosystem.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Exactly.
It's kind of important that we call that thing an ecosystem. It really is an ecosystem, and it's got biological properties, right? We need to pay more attention to life sciences, right?
Yep.
And to your point as well, Adrian, about if you really unpack the details, there's a lot of complexity in how these attacks work. But often that just teaches you small changes in how we do things. Like like the point that people struggle with the advice about, can I go to the beach or not? And the idea is, well, it kind of depends what you do there, right? If you walk on the beach, your risk is nearly zero. You go sunbathing on a beach, risk's probably a whole lot higher because there's probably somebody else breathing within 6 feet of you, right? And so people struggle with that. But when you get into all those details and you try and figure out what the common advice is, well, the health professionals spent a lot of time and energy on this last March as the stuff hit the fan. And they came up with social distancing. Simple idea. Now everybody understands social distancing. We understand why it's effective. We understand that it's important. I have some friends who live up in rural Northern California, and the local signs up there are "keep 1 cow apart." That's how they describe it. That was great. So we can get these ideas. And they apply perfectly well in cybersecurity as well, right? We have to keep our machinery apart. And that's what I meant about the gift, right? The gift here is we can suddenly explain something as abstract as zone defense or microsegmentation, very complicated security ideas with very complicated implications. We can explain that now to business teams to say, look, the reason we need you to have a good boundary around your VPC when you're doing all your wonderful business innovation for your new service, the reason we need to do a security audit of the access controls is because we're trying to maintain social distancing.
Right. Keep your
People can now understand what we mean.
Keep your VPCs one cow apart.
Exactly. It's funny, but it's funny because it's true that people can now begin to understand what on earth were we talking about the whole time. So this great gift of the language of the pandemic that allows us to explain what we need for security. We need social distancing, we need contact tracing, and we need basic hygiene.
Right.
Everybody now knows, that is in fact an appropriate response to a scary disease.
Mm.
We should maybe flick through a couple of these. I mean, I could go on and on about lateral movement. This is what I've been studying for decades now, about how diseases spread and how now attackers spread, right? It's a contact mechanism and it propagates out, and humans really suck at analyzing this stuff, right? Mm-hmm. We are inherently linear thinkers. We're inherently element thinkers. We like thinking one element at a time. We don't like taking on the complex interaction of that squiggly little red arrow, right? That's where our brains start to melt. Mm. When you do this at a large scale in a network. And unfortunately, that is exactly how attacks propagate. They get foothold someplace, and then they move laterally, and that lateral movement is where human brains just let us down. We just can't think well about chess moves when the chess board is 1 million squares wide by 1 million squares deep. Mm-hmm. Right, so that's why I use machinery, and the basic hygiene we've talked about a fair bit as well, right? The way that it's so hard in security to keep people's focus on something when we sort of get up to 95% compliance, right? That's where the security mindset is so different from everybody else's mindset. Every other thing in business, 95% is more than good enough.
Well, right? I'd argue, Mike, accounting might be that other discipline that has to have that 100%, right?
Fair point. The accountants and the security people are the only two who are really obsessed with completeness.
Yep.
Right? If classically, I think a lot of us have sort of an ops background. From a net ops point of view, if your inventory is 95% complete, damn, you're good at this, right? You actually understood what 95% of that stuff under the fridge we talked about earlier is.
But you're right. I've spoken with security teams, and even if they're at 99%, Mike, they're like, but we're really worried about that 1%, Paul. How do we get that 1%? I'm like, 1% is changing. I mean, even years ago, I might have said every day. Now I'd probably say potentially every hour or every minute, that 1% is changing.
Right, and sadly for the security teams, right, one of the deep lessons I think is it's only the security team that has to go 90%, 99%, 99.9, 99.99, right, and each extra halving of the remainder costs about double the effort, right? It gets harder and harder and harder to actually get closer and closer to complete.
Well, and it's funny too, like network teams, you've got TCP, and that if you drop a few packets, it's not a big deal. Like it takes care of itself, so you don't have to provide that, right? There's a lot of analogies there.
They've got a lot of resilient engineering in what they do, and of course, maybe for the Security Weekly audience, this doesn't need any repeating, but I do find people outside security think we're incredibly anal and picky when we get obsessed with 99 or 99.9. But the point, of course, is the bad guys, either through great skill or simple evolutionary pressure, go hide in the 1%. Yep, that's what they do. Right? Whatever 1% you're not looking at, that is where the nasty stuff will be. Yeah,
that attacker mindset as to permeate not just in security folks. We tend to understand that, but it has to go into all the other areas of the organization as well to understand that. I think most of the convincing we've had to do when we talk about cloud and cloud complexity is convince people that, yes, attackers will go after like that 1% of things we haven't configured correctly, and we need to find that first.
Right, and why does junk accumulate under the fridge? Because that's where we don't look.
Right.
Yep. Right. So Mike, I'm curious if I would suspect you're familiar with the Swiss cheese model.
Absolutely, yeah.
With that framework, that's something I've wondered. Do you find that's kind of a useful visual model for this kind of thing? When talking about don't focus on one layer of defense.
For myself and the audience, explain the Swiss cheese model.
There's a thing we talk about especially at RedSeal where we talk about cheese graters. There's sort of an elaborate version of this that says, look, network access controls are like cheese graters. If you sort of imagine a sheet of metal with some holes drilled in it, the problem is most modern network controls there's an awful lot of holes that have been drilled because the world gets complicated, right? We've been talking about that for 45 minutes now. But between me and you, in any given network, there's a whole collection of these cheese graters that have been set up. And now the question is, can I see you or not, right? If I shine a light through from my side, will it come out on your side or not? This is in effect what we do at RedSeal. We go analyze all of this fabric and go figure out all of the cheese graters, all these plates that have been put into a network, all these control points, and all the holes. The sort of it's a take on the Swiss cheese analogy, right? But I'm just making it a bit more concrete in terms of what we do, and it's part of why it's so complicated, right? That visual of, wait, you're saying that as a security professional, if I want to understand lateral movement, I have to understand all of the cheese graters everywhere in the network and all of the alignment of holes through all of the separate control layers to understand, okay, can a bad guy can they do lateral movement from over here to over there, right? Unless you work in security, you have no idea how hard it is to answer a question like, if somebody compromised application A, can they then move laterally into application B? That was the contact tracing point earlier, right? Contact tracing in networks is incredibly difficult because of these layers upon layers of these things with holes in, right? And so in a way, I just think of this as it's an illustration. It's an analogy that helps people get the brain around why is it that humans fail? Because one of the hard things with this complexity is if it's so complex that humans can't understand it, it's hard for humans to understand that they don't understand it. And so you have to have some way to explain that complexity down a level. And that's where I end up talking about Swiss cheese or these cheese graters all aligned. And how could you tell when you look through them all whether or not you have a pathway or not? One firewall, one access control, one rule is not too hard to understand. One piece of straw is not too hard to understand. It's the accumulation of all of them that is so difficult, right?
Yeah, I remember the last time I was on
the last point on that slide. It's complete consistency at scale is hard, right? Consistency isn't, we know what to do. It's just hard to do anything consistently at scale.
Yeah, I remember the last time I was on the enterprise side, we were troubleshooting something, and in our troubleshooting, we came to find that we actually had 3 stateful firewalls layered one by one, and the 2 we didn't realize were there were in products that weren't firewalls. That wasn't their primary purpose. I think one was an F5 application. Is it delivery controller? ADC. So it was an F5 ADC, and then we had an Imperva WAF, and both of those have stateful firewalls. And each one, including the actual Palo Alto stateful firewall, were all managed by different teams. So here we had 3 different firewall rule sets on 3 completely different devices that did 3 completely different things managed by different people. And at that moment when I realized that, my top of my head came off.
Right.
Like,
but that goes,
how are we going to,
Mike, that goes back to your point of having computers distill down this complexity so that humans can understand it and apply critical thinking. And that's, Adrian, certainly a use case. I bet in that same situation, right, where you're just like, oh my God, I can't wrap my brain around it. And I think to a product pitch for just a brief moment, right, that's where RedSeal comes in to help us understand those complexities.
Yeah, maybe go forward one more slide.
Sure.
This, if you like, it's a philosophical version of it, but this, in a sense, is a product pitch, right? Why do it RedSeal's way? And the way I try and explain it, right? So this, if you like, is the answer, right, of how you can deal with all this, right? Because we've said all these cheerful things about how terrifyingly difficult security is, but security is not the only difficult field in the world, right? There are many others. And we as humans, we tend to think checklist, right? I already talked about that. We're very linear. We like to think an element at a time. And the security business has a heritage of just using checklists. Checklists have their place, but they don't make you secure. And why not? Well, imagine a house that was made out of perfect bricks. Is that house made of perfect bricks immune to falling down? Well, of course it isn't, right? You can build a bad house out of perfect bricks. Okay, so checklists are never going to get you there. So how can you tell whether a house as a whole is any good? You can't do it by just asking, well, I'll just go check that each brick was made correctly. Okay, so what you got there in a house is a complex system, and people can sort of intuitively understand that. Well, how do we deal in any other field with complex interacting systems? Well, we use modeling, right? So a lot of people don't really appreciate why models have value. But if you look at any complicated field, weather, how do we predict weather? We use weather modeling. That's how we make weather forecasts, and we're getting better and better at it, at least over a 6 or 7 day range. Epidemics. Well, of course, we talked about that plenty. That's where I started in this whole thing. Crash testing, right? We of course we smash cars together, and that's fun to look at. But that's not the only thing people do to figure out whether a car is going to be crashworthy. They start by modeling a car and doing a lot of numerical simulations before you get to play with the crash test dummies, right? And maybe the best one, I think, for security is earthquakes, right? Back to the perfect house. Is your house going to survive or not? How do people trying to understand earthquake readiness of buildings work? Do they do it by earthquake stress testing each brick? No. They do it by building a model of the building, sticking it on a shaking table and shaking it till it falls down. And then you understand its failure modes, right? And that is what we need to be doing for cybersecurity, right? We can't solve the problems we're talking about. All that profusion on your slide, Adrian, of all the different bits of technology. We can't just make a checklist of here's how you correctly configure S3. Here's how you correctly configure a laptop. Here's how you correctly configure a telephone, right? That just gets you individual bricks that are nicely checked out. But is the house any good? You can't tell. Well, let's do what the earthquake people do. Let's build a scale model of the fabric, stick it on a shaking table and see how it fails. What does that mean in cybersecurity? Well, you need to be able to simulate attacks against a complete model of your infrastructure, and then you'll understand its failure modes. This is the only way to think about it as a system. If you think about it as elements, you will never successfui secure it.
I feel like Mike is like Doctor Strange in Infinity War, where he's going through all the different scenarios, right?
Oh, yeah.
Right? I had that moment where I was like,
I've shaken this house so
many millions of times and come up with one scenario, and we're not going to like it because that's how we're going to get hacked, right? Yeah.
I think to one point there, if you don't do the simulations, you're not going to find out. But the only other way to find out is to actually go through failures and learn from those failures. And I think that's one thing that is a big issue in security where, if there's a big earthquake, there's tons of data available in the public domain over how these buildings failed. When we have car crashes, when airplanes crash, when ships collide, there are public incident reports, and you can comb through the details and learn from them. But when there's breaches, unless it's big enough, that there's some kind of, grand jury or something like that, or a class action lawsuit, that results in the incident report becoming public. Generally, those details are hidden from us, so we're not even learning from the real public examples of a lot of these things.
That's awesome, but that's the start of another hour, right?
It is. It is.
Fire suppression in cities, the Great Fire of London.
Oh wait, was it? What was it in Iceland? You said it's a big study in epidemiology.
Yeah, measles in Iceland is a particular. It's canonical for anybody who does any epidemiology. You end up knowing an awful lot about Icelandic transport because Iceland is a perfect model, just like this building. Iceland has remarkable public health records. They go really, really far back. It's a small island community, so measles never got to be endemic. They had epidemic breakouts, but the disease couldn't be sustained in a small island population. So there are these amazing records, the way you can see the arrival of measles, where one infected sailor would arrive, and then you get another wave going out across a population that has no immunity. Of course, in human terms, it's a terrifying story, right? A lot of people die each time this happens. But as an academic exercise, it was amazing that when you went through these records, that you could watch things like the change in transport. You could watch the measles infections in the island of Iceland. You could see when they were doing transport by ship around the island, port to port to port, and then the disease would move that way too. And then eventually the bus comes along, and the bus becomes the main form of transport. And you can see a shift in how the epidemic would spread across the island, because you could now watch the transportation patterns. Now, we're going to run out of time to unpack this, but of course, in modern computer networks, you can see exactly the same thing. As we shift around, we'll work from home and use cloud services. That's a whole new way of doing transport. It's like the way moving from ship transport port to port around Iceland, shifting instead to bus transport. Then you get shifts in how the epidemics spread, but you still have to worry about the same kind of containment strategies. But you have to understand how lateral movement is going to work. Right? If you know there's been an outbreak in one city, you have to think about, well, where do the buses go from that city, and do your containment effort there. and you can't do that if you don't understand that it's actually the buses that are transporting the disease, the main disease vector. So that's a very compressed version of the Iceland story. But yeah, every epidemiologist learns a lot about Icelandic measles.
But in Adrian, to your point, I think we should focus more on the breach reports and how it unfolded in other people's networks and apply. I think that's the right. What we're talking about is the right application of threat intelligence, right? Having the right data and the right examples to apply to making decisions today.
Yeah, and I think until people are required to do that, the fear of reputational impact means most businesses are going to keep that a secret.
Right.
So,
so the disclosure thing really could be the launch of a whole other conversation. But maybe in the interest of time, skip this one. This explains background of how RedSeal does what it does. And this one maybe is the only other slide I've got time to get into. The reason I wanted to come here is just to try and make a bit more concrete. Right? We've had a great conversation, but we offered that we talk about how to conquer cloud complexity, and so I need to actually talk about what the technology really does. So what this slide does, it describes how at RedSeal we try to use this thinking. So just to try and make the philosophy we've been talking about a bit more concrete, you see the three big blue boxes on the side, the great gift of education that everybody's had, even outside security, about basic hygiene, social distancing, and understanding lateral movement. Well, how do you do any of that? Well, at least the way we approach it at RedSeal is first you gather all the network into one place, right? We talked about the 99% knowledge, shining a flashlight under the fridge. Is that good enough? We end up spending a lot of time with customers helping them map out all of their cloud fabric, understanding that because they can see a VPC over here and they can see a VPC peering coming out of it, and they don't have the VPC at the other end, you might want to go gather that.
Yep.
So there's a lot to do just in that basic hygiene and making sure you haven't violated any of the CIS checks or anything like that. So you've got to make sure that all of the elements, let's say in your cloud fabric, follow best practices. That's your basic hygiene. And when we work with customers, that's the first thing they need to do. So you got to get an inventory and you got to do checklists. I was poo-pooing checklists earlier, but they still have their role. It's just, that's only the equivalent of washing your hands. That's not advanced cybersecurity. If you want to get more advanced, social distancing, back to that idea, well, what does that mean? That gets to sort of the Swiss cheese thinking, right? Well, you need to be able to build a model. We talked about the earthquake shaking table. Well, now I'm talking about taking all that network fabric, the cloud fabric, the on-prem stuff, integrating it all together and putting it on a shaking table. And we can then ask, once we have that complete model of the fabric in a computer model, we can ask what has access to what. Right? I talked about the cheese graters, about can I see you through all the access controls from where I stand to where you stand? A bit like ray tracing for animators, right? If I shine a light over here, does it land on that object over there or does it get deflected? That's the game of understanding access controls. You would think that is easy, right? If we had that standardization we talked about a little bit ago, maybe this wouldn't be so hard. But in fact, it is incredibly hard to understand all of the access control languages of all of that stuff you had on your slide, Adrian. So that's why the social distancing part involves understanding zone boundaries, understanding, okay, well, I have, let's say, a VPC over here, and inside that, there's a database zone. Well, nice, simple question. Nothing in the database zone should be exposed to the internet. Nice, simple sentence, right? Everybody knows that's what we need to do, right? The database servers don't need to surf the internet, right? So we need to block access between the internet and the storage. Yeah, but can you prove that? What we find, get very practical and modern about it. When there's been this great rush to Kubernetes managed containers at the moment. When you look at Kubernetes controls, you can understand what the access is like within the Kubernetes walled garden, but that doesn't actually tell you whether or not you're exposed to the internet. That's a complex interaction of Kubernetes controls plus some VPC controls plus some elastic IP, or I'm using Amazon terminology, and you have to translate all this into Google terminology or Oracle terminology, or for whatever cloud you like to use, or Azure as well. But it's the interaction of all of those pieces to understand, is the database exposed to the internet or not? Simple sentence, really hard to answer because of the profusion of controls. Well, that's what we do as the second major step. So you can understand, do I have social distancing or don't I? Is my database on the internet or isn't it? And then the most sophisticated level is to understand lateral movement, where now we actually unleash attackers. We actually shake the shaking table really hard. We take the model, we inject vulnerability data, and we inject bad actors, simulated bad actors, and we just see what chain of vulnerabilities is exposed. If somebody were to attack you, how would it go down? In effect, how easily can we make your whole building fall down on the shaking table? And then we can summarize all that up into an overall posture score, something like a credit rating of how well did this network do when we put it on the shaking table. So we spent sort of, almost the whole hour talking about the background. And on this one slide, I've tried to say, okay, so what we do, check the basics, build a model, shake it, see where it falls down, and then summarize it all in a posture score. That's what we do at RedSeal.
No, I think that came together nicely, Mike. Actually, that's really awesome. Sorry, did we have? I know we said we were going to take questions during, but I had some systems failure that prevented me from doing that. Adrian, I don't know if you have access to the chat, or if Johnny has any questions from the audience. We can spend a couple of minutes answering any question.
Okay.
See if Adrian can pull that up. Sorry, Adrian, we didn't give you advance notice.
That's no problem. I usually minimize the Discords and the Slacks in these because people sometimes post GIFs.
It gets distracting. I know.
Busting up laughing when somebody's telling a terrifying security story is never a good move.
If you put the computer here in the studio on a shaking table, it wouldn't last very long, apparently.
Right. So I was actually going to make a comment, and one of these questions touches on that. Talking about needing some kind of validation, something to tell you how things are configured. Is that database open to the outside? From my consulting experience, I can tell you 100% of the time things were not configured the way that people thought they were configured. So one of these, the first question is, how do you think ML and AI will affect our environments? And a second thought is, when is the last time you saw a good network diagram? They seem to be going by the wayside.
Wow. Okay. Either of those could be an hour on its own, right? Maybe I'll start with the network diagram one, just because it's a little bit easier. I have the same sort of cynicism that the person who wrote the question does, right? I would visit organizations and they'd have a big network map on the wall, and in the lower right corner it would say, December 2015. It's like, whatever that map was, hey, nice wall art. That's no longer what your fabric looks like. Network maps need to be living documents, and if they're being handmade in Visio, sorry, it ain't going to cut it. I will say that is a great job for automation. I mean, you don't have to believe RedSeal on everything. You don't have to, you don't have to buy our product. But I think I can assert, just as a factual matter, if you have a network map that isn't being made by a machine, the map is wrong, right? Now, I make maps that are maintained by machines, right? So I'm quite good at this. I'm kind of specialized in it. But I do think I can just say, if your idea of a network map is, well, I take Visio and I hand draw it, whatever it is you draw, it's wrong by the time you finish drawing it. You have to use machinery for that problem.
It's interesting, Mike, when I diagram out our production setup, which is largely physical pieces, it's still the same thing. Like, we just had a failure today and we're already going to change it, and now my diagram's out of date.
Right. And now there was also the AI and ML point. Now there I could go on and on. I'm a big cynic about AI, right? There's this big human psychology problem of, we put personhood into everything, right? We love cartoons, right? There are these psychology experiments where we can make circles and triangles, in a cartoon, and humans will add stories about what the circle's trying to do and what the triangle's trying to do. We do this for AI. This is why AI is so tempting, why people believe thinking computers are just around the corner. They have been 10 years away since 1960, people. They're always 10 years away. We never actually get the general purpose thinking computer. But ML is still taking over the world, but why? Because there are some uses for pattern matching. Those uses are really not security. ML systems are fantastic at recognizing patterns that they've been fed in historical data sets. Historical. That's useless in security. The whole point in security is the bad guys keep changing what they do. So by definition, ML systems, classic ML systems, are not going to work for most security problems. They have a role in anti-fraud for stopping people who do the same kind of theft that they've always done, right?
I think Google has their Photos product about 80% accurate, which is a classic use case for ML. I showed a bunch of pictures of a cat, and now I can go through my pictures and find all the cats.
And the field of AI safety is an amazing one, right? Really eye-opening business. I was at a security conference actually just recently, a virtual one, and they were talking about how to increase diversity in this business, how to make it more inclusive, because we have this massive skills gap. And some guy was saying, oh yeah, there's this fantastic startup that uses AI and ML for hiring, where you just give it a LinkedIn profile and it goes to find you more candidates who have that same LinkedIn profile. Now, this was in a conversation about how we increase diversity. Wait. Go find me more people with the same kind of white skin and educational background as the people we already hire. How does that increase diversity, right? AI and ML especially is great at reinforcing everything we did wrong.
Yes.
It's very easy to make racist ML.
Yep.
Now, I bitch and moan about ML, maybe not so much about AI, because AI is so broad that it can cover a multitude of sins. To just be enthusiastic about something, I would call what I do machine reasoning. I don't call it machine learning. I think machine learning is way overhyped, oversold. We imbue too much into it. It's not going to deliver the promise. Machine reasoning is where you teach a machine what it is you want. You give it some rules, like I want to shine the flashlight under the fridge. I want to make sure the database isn't exposed to the internet. And it can do the reasoning for you, because that's what machines are good at: exhaustive computation of complex interacting systems. So I do like machine reasoning. Personally, I'm not about to get a job in machine learning. I think the bubble on that will burst sometime soon, I hope.
Any last questions we can answer quickly, because I know we're a little over time already, but if not, we've captured all the questions, and we'll make sure we get answers out to those people.
Yeah, there were a few more questions, but there are things that we could maybe answer in Discord later, or something like that. There's one asking, somebody was asking if simulations, using listening to simulations, bad actors could use that against us. So by using the same methods we use basically to predict what we're going to do with our defenses.
Annie DeFranco said it best: every tool is a weapon if you hold it right. Right?
Yeah, dual use, right?
Yep.
And absolutely, what I make is dual use, right? I have a lot of intel and military customers, and some of them are really paranoid because people really are out to get them. And I have at least some spook customers who do not deploy RedSeal onto a network. They use RedSeal, but they use it off network. They use it air-gapped, because they understand that fundamentally what we make is a map of how to break in.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
When you take the shaking table and you analyze its results, it tells you how to break in. And so they actually have us air-gapped from all networks, because what we make could be that terrifying. So yeah, legitimately there is dual use of any of this stuff. I don't recommend for most organizations they go to those extreme air-gapping measures. You can protect this data, but yes, if you can model how to break in, there can be consequences of understanding that.
Well, Adrian, Mike, thank you so much for the webcast today. For folks that want to learn more, securityweekly.com/RedSeal. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. See you next time.